The massive space station floated silently near a dying star. Its metal walls stretched for miles in every direction, housing thousands of students from across the galaxy. This was the Galactic Survival Institute, the most respected school for learning how to save worlds from disaster. Getting accepted here was harder than becoming a planetary governor. Graduating was even harder. Daewon walked through the crowded hallway, his human frame shorter than most of the alien students around him. He carried a datapad under one arm and a cup of something that barely passed for coffee in the other. After 6 months at the institute, he had learned which food dispensers to avoid and which ones might actually give him something edible. "Hey, wait up," a voice called from behind him. Hana jogged to catch up, her own datapad clutched against her chest. She was the only other human in their year. Actually, they were 2 of only 3 humans in the entire 4,000-year history of this place. The third had graduated decades ago and now ran disaster response for an entire sector. "Did you hear?" Hana asked, slightly out of breath. "Professor Veltaris is announcing the final exam today." Daewon took a sip of his terrible coffee and nodded. "Yeah, I heard. Everyone's been talking about it for weeks." They entered the massive lecture hall together. The room could hold 500 students, and today it was completely full. Beings of every shape and size filled the seats. Some had scales, others had fur, and a few were just floating clouds of gas held together by force fields. All of them looked nervous. Daewon and Hana found seats near the middle. Around them, students whispered anxiously to each other. A tall creature with 6 arms was reviewing notes frantically. Another student covered in blue feathers was breathing into a paper bag to calm down. "Is it always like this before finals?" Daewon asked quietly. "Apparently," Hana replied. "I talked to some second years last week. They said the final exam has a 50% failure rate, and if you fail, you have to wait a full year before you can retake it." A hush fell over the room as Professor Veltaris entered. The professor was a crystalline being, their body made of something that looked like living diamond. Light refracted through them in rainbow patterns as they moved to the center of the stage. Their species, the Vel, had evolved on a world so stable and perfect that they had never experienced a single natural disaster in their entire evolutionary history. No earthquakes, no storms, no asteroids, nothing. This made them excellent teachers of disaster theory. They could look at catastrophes with pure academic detachment, unclouded by fear or trauma. "Students," Professor Veltaris began, their voice resonating like wind chimes, "today I will explain your final examination. As you know, this test comprises 60% of your final grade. It is the culmination of everything you have learned here." The room somehow became even quieter. Daewon leaned back in his seat, interested but not particularly worried. Next to him, Hana sat up straighter. "You will each enter a simulation pod," the professor continued. "Inside you will experience a planetary crisis scenario. Your task is simple. Ensure the survival of at least 40% of the planet's population. You will have full administrative control and access to all planetary resources. The simulation will be comprehensive and realistic. Your decisions will have consequences." One student raised a tentacle-like appendage. "Professor, which scenarios might we face?" "The scenarios are randomized," Veltaris explained. "Possibilities include solar radiation events, asteroid impacts, supervolcanic eruptions, pandemic outbreaks, pole reversals, or technological catastrophes. Each scenario is calibrated to be extremely challenging, but theoretically survivable with proper planning and execution." Nervous murmurs rippled through the hall. Daewon noticed that many students had pulled out their datapads and were frantically searching through their notes on specific disaster types. A student from the Centauri system, a being named Kira with orange skin and 3 eyes, leaned over to Daewon. "Which scenario are you hoping to get?" "I'm praying it's not an asteroid. I'm terrible at calculating orbital mechanics under pressure." Daewon smiled slightly, that casual human expression that never quite translated well to aliens. "I'm not too worried about it. It's all pretty similar when you get down to it." Kiro's 3 eyes widened. "Similar? An asteroid impact is completely different from a pandemic." "Sure, the details are different," Daewon agreed. "But the core problem is the same. You've got limited time, limited resources, and you need to save as many people as possible. The specifics just determine which tools you use." Before Kiro could respond, another student jumped into the conversation. This was Tella, a being covered in blue feathers who had been breathing into a bag earlier. How can you be so calm? Last year, only 12 students passed. 12 out of 40. Those are terrible odds. Daewon shrugged. Worrying won't change the outcome. Either I know the material or I don't. Hana hid a smile behind her hand. She had seen this reaction from aliens before. Humans had a reputation in the galaxy for being weirdly casual about dangerous situations. Most species couldn't understand it. Professor Velteris raised a crystalline hand for silence. The examination will take place in 3 days. You will report to the simulation center at your assigned time. Each simulation will run for approximately 6 hours, though the subjective time inside may feel much longer. You may experience anywhere from several days to several years within the scenario. Years? Someone gasped from the back. Subjective years, the professor clarified. Compressed time is necessary to evaluate long-term decision-making and crisis management. Some scenarios require you to plan not just for immediate survival, but for rebuilding civilization afterward. The nervous energy in the room had escalated to barely controlled panic. Students were already forming study groups, planning to spend the next 3 days reviewing every possible scenario. One more thing, Professor Velteris added. The survival rate of 40% is the minimum passing grade. However, the scenarios are scaled in difficulty. Saving 40% of a population during a minor solar flare is not equivalent to saving 40% during a major asteroid impact. Your final grade will reflect both the difficulty of your scenario and your performance within it. Daewon noticed that Kiro had gone slightly pale, his orange skin fading to a lighter shade. This is insane. How are we supposed to prepare for every possible scenario in just 3 days? You're not, Hana said quietly. You've been preparing all semester. The 3 days are just for review. After the professor dismissed the class, the hall erupted into frantic activity. Students rushed out in groups, already arguing about study strategies and scenario probabilities. Daewon and Hana took their time, walking slowly toward the exit. You really aren't worried, are you? Hana asked. Should I be? Most people would be terrified. Daewon considered this as they walked. I guess it's different for us. We grew up with this stuff. Remember all those disaster drills in school? Fire drills, earthquake drills, lockdown drills, evacuation procedures. We learned what to do if there was a nuclear attack before we learned algebra. True, Hana agreed. And then there's all the entertainment. Movies, books, games, all about surviving the end of the world. Zombies, aliens, robots, plagues, climate disasters. We consume apocalypse scenarios for fun. They passed a group of students huddled around a data terminal, pulling up research on historical disasters from their home worlds. Most of them were finding very little data. Their species had simply never faced catastrophes on the scale that would be tested in the exam. Kiro caught up with them near the dining hall. Daewon, Hana, some of us are forming a study group. We're going to review every major disaster type and practice response protocols. Do you want to join? Daewon and Hana exchanged glances. Sure, Daewon said. Could be useful. The study group met that evening in one of the common rooms. 12 students had gathered, representing 8 different species. They spread out notes, pulled up holographic displays, and dove into disaster scenarios. Let's start with asteroid impacts, suggested a student with green scales. Those seem most common in the historical database. For the next several hours, they worked through scenarios. Daewon and Hana participated, offering suggestions and answering questions. But they noticed something interesting. The alien students were all focused on prevention, how to deflect the asteroid, how to stop the plague, how to prevent the eruption. What if you can't stop it? Daewon asked during a discussion about supervolcanoes. The room went quiet. What do you mean? Asked Tella. What if the volcano is going to erupt no matter what you do? What if your only option is to manage the survival of people during and after the eruption? The concept seemed to disturb several students. But the point is to save the planet, someone said. The point is to save the people, Daewon corrected gently. Sometimes that means accepting that the planet itself is going to change and you can't stop it. You can only adapt to it. This led to an uncomfortable discussion about acceptable losses, triage, and worst-case planning. Several students seemed almost offended by the idea of planning for failure. Their cultures had taught them that good leadership meant preventing disasters, not managing them. As the study session wound down near midnight, Kiro approached Daewon privately. Can I ask you something? How do humans think about this stuff? You and Hana seem so comfortable with scenarios that terrify the rest of us. Daewon thought about how to explain it. Our planet tried to kill us a lot. Ice ages, supervolcanoes, plagues, asteroids. We almost went extinct more than once. I guess we learned that survival isn't about preventing every disaster. It's about being too stubborn to die when disaster happens anyway. Kiro shuddered, all three eyes blinking in sequence. That sounds like a nightmare world. Yeah, Daewon agreed with a slight smile. But we're still here. 3 days later, Daewon stood outside his assigned simulation pod. Through the transparent door, he could see the chair where he would sit, the neural interface that would connect him to the simulation, and the monitors that would track his vital signs. Other students were entering their pods along the curved hallway. Some looked determined, others looked terrified. Hana gave him a thumbs up from her own pod entrance down the hall. Daewon stepped inside and the door sealed behind him with a soft hiss. He settled into the chair and placed the neural interface on his head. The system initialized, running diagnostics on his brain patterns. In the observation room, Professor Velteris and 4 other faculty members prepared to monitor the examinations. Dozens of screens showed different students in their pods, waiting for their scenarios to begin. Initiate examination protocols, Velteris commanded. Across the station, scenarios loaded. Students gasped as they found themselves suddenly standing on alien worlds, receiving emergency briefings, facing their challenges. Daewon's screen flickered to life. He stood in what appeared to be an emergency command center. Alarms were blaring. A holographic display showed a planet, and his breath caught slightly as he read the incoming data. Massive asteroid impact, extinction level. Volcanic winter to follow. Tectonic destabilization causing mega tsunamis. Planetary shield grid failing. And a plague outbreak in the capital city. 4 simultaneous apocalypse scenarios. All at once. In the observation room, a faculty member noticed Daewon's scenario and gasped. Professor, there's been an error. Student Daewon has received a combination scenario. This is a research-level catastrophe, not a student examination. Professor Velteris moved quickly to Daewon's monitor, their crystalline form refracting light in sharp, worried patterns. They reached for the emergency shutdown controls. But they paused. On the screen, Daewon wasn't panicking. He wasn't frozen in shock. He was reading through the scenario details with the focused expression of someone reviewing a grocery list. And then, impossibly, he smiled. That casual, confident human smile. He cracked his knuckles, leaned forward, and said to himself, "Finally, a decent challenge." Professor Velteris's hand hovered over the shutdown button, crystalline fingers trembling slightly. "Which apocalypse scenario are we using?" Daewon muttered, still smiling as he began issuing his first commands. Apparently all of them. The professor didn't shut down the simulation. Instead, they signaled to the other faculty members. "I want everyone watching this now." The command center simulation felt completely real. Daewon could smell the recycled air, feel the vibration of machinery beneath his feet, and hear the constant ping of incoming alerts. Around him, holographic staff members waited for his orders, their faces showing the exact mixture of fear and desperate hope that real people would have in this situation. He pulled up the full planetary status report. New Haven, the colony world he was supposed to save, had a population of 8 million. It was a fairly standard terraformed planet with 3 major cities and dozens of smaller settlements. 72 hours until the asteroid hit. Maybe 50,000 people could be evacuated off-world with the available ships. That left 7.95 million people who would have to survive here. The volcanic winter would last at least 5 years. The tsunamis would destroy all coastal infrastructure within 6 hours of impact. The shield grid that protected the planet from radiation was already failing and would be completely offline in 48 hours. And the plague in the capital city had a mortality rate of about 28%, with infection spreading exponentially. Any one of these disasters would be considered a nightmare scenario. Together, they should be impossible. Daewon took a deep breath and started working. In the observation room, more faculty members had gathered. Word was spreading through the institute that something unusual was happening. Professor Velteris stood at the center, watching Daewon's screen with an expression that was hard to read on a crystalline face. "He's not calling for help," observed Professor Mina, a being composed of floating golden spheres. Most students immediately request emergency support from nearby systems. "There isn't time for help to arrive," noted another professor. Even at maximum faster than light speed, the nearest response fleet is 90 hours away. Exactly, Veltaris said quietly. He's already calculated that. He knows he's alone. On screen, Day One had divided his command center display into 4 sections, one for each crisis. His hands moved rapidly across the holographic controls, entering commands faster than the monitoring system could easily track. His first action surprised everyone. He sent a message to all off-world vessels with a simple priority list: children under 5, pregnant women, genetic samples of all major food crops, and the planet's entire digital archive. Not the wealthy, not the government officials, not even the brilliant scientists. Just the elements needed to preserve the species and its knowledge if everything else failed. Ruthless, murmured one observer, but logical. Then Day One did something that made several faculty members gasp. He pulled up the planetary map and began designating evacuation zones. But he wasn't moving people away from the impact site. He was moving them toward it. He's made an error, someone said. He's panicking and moving people into the danger zone. Wait, Professor Veltaris said, leaning closer to the screen. Look at the geological surveys. Day One had overlaid the impact trajectory with underground cave surveys. There was a massive cave system roughly 300 miles from ground zero. The impact would superheat the region, but the caves were deep, very deep, and they sat on top of geothermal vents. He's not trying to avoid the impact, Veltaris realized. He's planning to use it. The asteroid impact would create a volcanic winter on the surface. Temperatures would drop dramatically. Growing food would become nearly impossible. But those caves, flash-heated by the impact and sitting on geothermal vents, would become warm. They would be the only temperate zone on the entire planet. Day One was already issuing orders to start moving supplies into the caves. Food, medicine, tools, seeds, everything. He had 72 hours and he was using every second. Then he turned his attention to the plague. This was where he did something that made even Hana, watching from her own completed simulation, wince. He released the quarantine. What is he doing? Demanded a professor. He's going to kill millions. But Veltaris was reading the plague data more carefully. The mortality rate is 28%. That means 72% survive, and survivors show complete immunity in all recorded cases. He's weaponizing the disease, another faculty member whispered in horror. Day One had calculated something brutal but mathematically sound. The asteroid was coming no matter what. Medical infrastructure would be destroyed. Anyone who got the plague after the impact would die without treatment. But if he deliberately exposed people now, while he still had hospitals and medicine, 72% would survive and become immune. Those survivors would be protected during the chaotic aftermath. He was trading controlled deaths now for prevented deaths later. It was the kind of decision that most species couldn't even imagine making. The math was sound, but the ethics were devastating. Day One created exposure centers in every major city, voluntary at first with clear information about the risks. But he also made it clear, anyone heading to the cave shelters would be required to either have immunity or undergo exposure. There was no room in the survival plan for a plague outbreak in the enclosed cave systems. Time in the simulation moved faster than real time. What felt like hours to Day One were minutes in the observation room. The faculty watched as his first day unfolded. He had divided the population into groups, not based on social status, but on skills needed for survival and rebuilding. Engineers, farmers, doctors, teachers, craftspeople. He was building a post-apocalypse civilization while the world was still intact. Children were prioritized, but not all children equally. Older children who could work and learn got priority over infants who would require years of resource-intensive care. It was another brutal calculation that made sense mathematically but felt wrong emotionally. How does he think like this? Asked Professor Mina. He's barely into his second standard cycle of life. He's so young. Hana, who had been called to the observation room after completing her own simulation, spoke quietly. He's human. We're taught to think like this from childhood. Surely not, protested a faculty member. Hana pulled up her datapad and projected information onto one of the screens. Emergency preparedness drill starting at age 5. Disaster survival merit badges for youth organizations. Entire sections of our entertainment industry dedicated to apocalypse scenarios. We have a saying, hope for the best, plan for the worst. But this level of cold calculation, Veltaris said, This acceptance of mass death as a necessary factor. Where does that come from? History, Hannah replied simply. She pulled up Earth's geological and historical records. 75,000 years ago, the Toba supervolcano eruption reduced human population to between 3 and 10,000 individuals. We almost went extinct. Then ice ages, plagues, famines, wars. We've nearly died out at least a dozen times. The ones who survived were the ones who could make the hard choices. On screen, Daiwan had moved to his third crisis, the failing shield grid. He couldn't fix it in 72 hours. The damage was too extensive, so he stopped trying to fix it. Instead, he cannibalized it. He ordered the shield generators ripped apart and converted into radiation shelters for the caves. If he couldn't protect the whole planet, he would protect the places where people would actually be living. Then came the most spectacular decision. He started deliberately destroying infrastructure. Fusion reactors were set to overload in carefully calculated sequences. When the faculty realized what he was doing, several of them had to sit down. "He's triggering avalanches," Veltaris said in something approaching awe. "He's using reactor explosions to cause controlled landslides that will seal valley entrances, creating natural shelters." Day One was weaponizing everything. Every disaster was becoming a tool. The asteroid impact would heat the caves. The plague would create immunity. The failing shields would become radiation shelters. The reactors would become seismic weapons to reshape geography. 48 hours before impact in the simulation, the first evacuation ships left orbit. 50,000 people, mostly young children and a genetic bank that could restart civilization if everything else failed. Day One watched them go with an expression that the observers couldn't quite read. "Does he feel anything?" someone asked. "Is he just cold?" "Look at his vital signs," Professor Veltaris said, pointing to the biometric readout. "His stress hormones are elevated. Heart rate is high. He's terrified, but he's working anyway." That was what truly unsettled the observers. Day One wasn't some emotionless machine calculating optimal outcomes. He was afraid, possibly more afraid than any of them had ever been. But fear didn't stop him. It didn't even slow him down. The last 24 hours before impact were a blur of activity. 1.2 million people had made it into the cave systems. Another 100,000 were in hardened surface bunkers that probably wouldn't survive but were better than nothing. The rest, nearly 6.7 million people, were going to die. Day One had said goodbye to more than 80% of the planet's population. In those final hours, he did something that surprised the observers again. He recorded messages, thousands of them. Personal goodbyes from people in the caves to loved ones who hadn't made it. He couldn't save everyone, but he could give them this. "That's kind," Professor Mina said softly. "I didn't expect kindness." "Humans aren't cruel," Hannah said quietly. "We're just experienced with cruelty being necessary." The asteroid hit. The simulation rendered it in terrifying detail. A rock the size of a mountain slamming into the ocean at a significant fraction of light speed. The impact flash was bright enough to blind anyone looking at it. The shockwave radiated outward at supersonic speeds, shattering everything in its path. Coastal cities vanished under mega tsunamis that rose 300 feet high. The sky filled with debris. Earthquakes rippled across the planet as the crust itself rang like a struck bell. Volcanoes that had been dormant for millennia erupted simultaneously. In the observation room, several faculty members had to look away. They had studied disasters academically, but seeing one rendered in such detail was overwhelming. Day One's cave survivors felt the shockwave, heard the roar, and watched their seismic sensors go wild. But the caves held. The depth protected them from the worst of it. On the surface, everything was chaos. The sky turned black with ash and debris. Temperatures began dropping immediately as sunlight was blocked. The volcanic winter had begun. 97% of surface life died in the first week. But in the caves, Day One survivors were already adapting. The geothermal vents provided heat. Emergency hydroponics powered by the heat began growing food. The plague-immune population stayed healthy even in crowded conditions. The radiation shelters he'd built from shield generator parts protected them from the cosmic radiation, now bombarding the unprotected planet. "He's done it," someone whispered. "He's actually going to pull this off." "The simulation isn't over," Professor Veltaris noted. "His scenario includes a 5-year aftermath timeline. Most student scenarios end at the crisis point. His continues. That's not fair, protested a faculty member. Fair? Feltaris's crystalline body refracted light in sharp patterns that suggested agitation. He's facing 4 simultaneous apocalypses. Fair stopped being relevant the moment this scenario loaded. The observation room had filled with more than 30 faculty and staff now. Word had spread throughout the station. They were watching something unprecedented. Year 1 of the volcanic winter arrived. Surface temperatures had dropped 40 degrees. The oceans were freezing at the poles. The sky remained dark. Of the original 8 million, 1.2 million remained in the caves, a 15% survival rate. By any standard measure, that should be catastrophic. But day 1 wasn't finished. Those 1.2 million people weren't just surviving. They were organizing, adapting, and preparing to rebuild. He had created a functioning underground civilization in the ruins of the old world, and against all probability it was working. The faculty members watched in silence as the simulation continued. They had come to observe a student examination. What they were witnessing was something else entirely. They were watching a masterclass in survival, from a species that had learned these lessons in the hardest way possible, through extinction, death, and disaster again and again, until the survivors knew every terrible trick required to keep breathing when the universe tried to stop them. Day 1 sat in his simulation chair, subjectively living through years of catastrophe, making 10,000 decisions both large and small, keeping his people alive through the darkest period in their planet's history. And in the observation room, the galaxy's finest disaster management experts were taking notes. Year 2 of the volcanic winter began with a crisis that even day 1 hadn't fully anticipated. The hydroponic systems were failing. Inside the simulation, he stood in the largest cave chamber that had been converted into a farming facility. The lights that simulated sunlight for the plants were flickering. Power consumption was exceeding generation. If the hydroponics collapsed, the careful food production system he'd built would fail, and 1.2 million people would starve. In the observation room, Professor Veltaris noted the new crisis appearing on the monitoring screens. The scenario is adapting. It's generating realistic cascading problems based on his earlier decisions. Can he solve it? Asked Professor Mina. That depends on whether he can think creatively under pressure, Veltaris replied. Day 1 stood in the simulated cave, looking at rows of dying plants. His advisors, all AI-generated characters in the simulation, waited for his decision. He could shut down some of the farming sections to conserve power. That would mean less food, stricter rationing, and people would die slowly of hunger instead of quickly. He chose a different path. Show me the geothermal survey again, he ordered. The holographic display appeared, showing the heat signatures beneath the cave system. The geothermal vents were powerful, but they'd already been tapped for heating and basic power. Pushing them harder might destabilize the entire system. Day 1 studied the patterns for several minutes that felt like hours in the compressed simulation time. Then he pointed to 3 specific locations. Drill here, here, and here. We're going deeper. Sir, those depths are dangerous, one of his simulated advisors warned. If we breach the wrong layer, we could flood the caves with toxic gas or trigger seismic instability. I know the risks, Day 1 replied calmly. But we don't have a choice. We need more power and it's down there. Start drilling. The observers watching from outside the simulation saw his plan unfold. He was gambling that he could tap into deeper geothermal sources without killing everyone in the process. It was risky. It was desperate. It was exactly the kind of decision that separated survivors from casualties. The drilling took weeks in simulation time. Twice they hit pockets of volcanic gas that had to be vented carefully. Once they triggered a minor earthquake that collapsed one of the smaller cave sections. 37 people died in that collapse. Day 1 attended the memorial service in the simulation. He spoke briefly about sacrifice and necessity. Then he went back to work. When the 3rd drill finally breached the deep geothermal layer, superheated water erupted upward with tremendous force. For a terrifying moment, it looked like Day 1's gamble had failed catastrophically. But his engineering teams drilled endlessly in emergency procedures, managed to cap and control the flow. The new geothermal tap provided 3 times the power output of the original vents. The hydroponics stabilized. Food production actually increased. Remarkable, breathed a faculty member watching the scenario unfold. He turned a crisis into an opportunity. That's the second time he's done that, noted another observer. The asteroid heated the caves. The plague created immunity. The reactor explosions shaped the geography. Now the power crisis has led to a better energy source. Is he lucky or is he manipulating probability somehow? Hana, still present in the observation room, smiled slightly. It's neither. He's just refusing to accept that a crisis can only make things worse. Humans learned a long time ago that disasters also create opportunities if you're willing to look for them. Year 3 brought a different kind of problem. The children born before the impact were now growing up in a world that was nothing like the one their parents had known. They had never seen the sun. They had never been outside. They lived in caves, ate food grown under artificial light, and learned about a surface world that might as well be mythology. The psychological strain was beginning to show. Depression rates were climbing. There had been 3 suicides in the past month, a concept that had been almost unknown in the pre-impact colony. The careful social structure Daewon had built was beginning to crack. He called a meeting of the council, a group of elected representatives from different cave sections. The simulated characters argued about solutions. More entertainment programs, better lighting to simulate day and night cycles, increased rations to improve morale. Daewon listened to all of it, then stood up and said something that silenced the room. We're going to the surface. The council erupted in protests. The surface was death. Temperatures were still 30 degrees below the original average. The sky was still dark. Radiation levels were elevated. Nothing grew there. Nothing could survive, I know, Daewon said calmly. But we're going anyway. Not to live. Just to visit. We're going to build a surface outpost with a viewing platform. Every person in these caves is going to get a chance to go up there, look at the sky, and remember that there's a world outside waiting for us. That's insane, one council member protested. The resource cost would be enormous. The psychological cost of not doing it will be higher, Daewon replied. We're not animals living in burrows. We're humans building a future. That requires hope, not just survival. In the observation room, Professor Velteris made a note on their data pad. He's addressing psychological factors. Most students focus purely on physical survival metrics. His species must have learned this the hard way too, Professor Mina observed. The surface outpost took 4 months to build in simulation time. It was a small dome, barely large enough for 20 people, connected to the caves by an elevator shaft that took 10 minutes to ride. The dome had thick windows that could survive the harsh surface conditions and a heating system that made the interior marginally comfortable. When it opened, Daewon went up first. The simulation rendered the surface in depressing detail. The sky was a dark gray choked with ash. The temperature reading showed -15 degrees. The landscape was buried under volcanic ash and ice. Nothing moved. Nothing lived, but there was light. Faint, filtered through the ash clouds, but there. The sun was still up there, still burning. The world wasn't dead, just sleeping. Daewon stood at the window for a long time, looking out at the devastation. Then he activated the communication system and spoke to the entire population in the caves below. This is what we survived, he said quietly. This is what we beat. And someday when the sky clears and the temperature rises, this will be ours again. Our children will walk on this ground. Our grandchildren will build cities here. The world tried to kill us and we're still here. It was a speech that would have sounded absurd if delivered by someone who hadn't just saved 1.2 million people from 4 simultaneous apocalypses. But coming from Daewon, standing in that dome looking at the devastated surface, it sounded like a promise. The suicide rate dropped to 0 after that. People took turns visiting the surface outpost, groups of 20 at a time making the pilgrimage. It became a ritual, a reminder that they were survivors, not just victims. The observers watched this development with fascination. He's creating culture, one of them said. He's not just managing resources, he's shaping how these people think about themselves. Year 4 brought stability. The deep geothermal power was steady. Food production had actually exceeded pre-impact levels, thanks to optimization of the hydroponic systems. The birth rate was healthy. Education programs were running smoothly. Medical care was adequate. Daewon had created a functioning civilization in the aftermath of an extinction-level event. But he wasn't relaxing. He was planning for the next phase. Show me the atmospheric projections, he ordered his science team. The data appeared. The ash was beginning to settle. Slowly, painfully slowly, but settling. In another year, maybe 2, sunlight penetration would increase. Temperatures would start to rise. The volcanic winter was ending. "We need to be ready for surface operations," Daewon announced. "I want teams preparing seed stocks for surface planting. I want engineers designing structures that can handle the current conditions. I want scouts ready to explore and map the changed geography." "Sir, we're comfortable here," one advisor said. "Why risk surface operations?" "Because comfortable isn't the same as thriving," Daewon replied. "We've survived. Now we need to rebuild. That means reclaiming the surface." He pulled up the old maps of New Haven, the colony as it had been before the impact. "This is gone," he said, gesturing at the cities, the farms, the infrastructure. "All of it. We're not restoring the old world. We're building a new one." The planning for surface operations took months. Teams were trained in hostile environment protocols. Equipment was designed and built. Agricultural experts developed plant strains that could survive in the harsh conditions. It was a massive undertaking, but Daewon approached it with the same methodical determination he'd shown throughout the crisis. In the observation room, the gathered faculty were in a state of professional shock. They had come to observe a student examination. What they were witnessing was a comprehensive demonstration of crisis management at a level most of them had never seen. "How long has he been in the simulation?" someone asked. 4 subjective years, Veltaris replied. "About 3 hours real-time. Is he actually enjoying this?" "Look at his biometrics," Veltaris said, pointing to the vital signs display. "Stress levels are elevated but not critical. He's focused, engaged. This is what his species does." They survive. Year 5 arrived. The sky was noticeably lighter. Temperatures had risen 10 degrees from their lowest point. It was still cold, still harsh, but it was improving. Daewon led the first surface expedition personally. 20 people in environment suits carrying equipment and seeds emerged from the caves into the transformed world. The landscape was alien. The impact had created a new mountain range. Rivers flowed in different directions. The coastlines had changed dramatically. It was New Haven, but barely recognizable. They found a valley sheltered from the worst winds with soil that might be workable. Daewon knelt down and dug his gloved hand into the ash-covered ground. Beneath the ash, the soil was cold but not frozen, not dead. "This is where we start," he said. Over the next months in simulation time, the surface outpost grew into a small settlement. The first crops were planted in greenhouses that captured the limited sunlight and supplemented it with geothermal power. The plants grew slowly, struggling against the harsh conditions, but they grew. The population in the caves was doing more than surviving now. They were expanding, learning, adapting. Children who had been born after the impact were now 5 years old, growing up in a world their parents could never have imagined. Daewon stood in the surface settlement one simulated evening, watching the sunset through the still hazy atmosphere. The sun was a dim red circle, but it was visible. The long night was ending. His final population count appeared on his display, 1.4 million people. Not only had he saved 1.2 million, but they had reproduced and grown. The civilization was stable, expanding, and preparing for a future on the surface. The simulation began to wind down. Systems showed that the 5-year evaluation period was complete. Final metrics were being calculated. In the observation room, Professor Veltaris began compiling the results. Survival rate 17.5%. Civilization continuity intact. Technological regression minimal. Cultural cohesion high. Psychological stability good. Long-term sustainability excellent. By standard measurements, anything above 30% survival was considered exceptional. But this scenario had been rated at 4 times normal difficulty. His adjusted score will be, Professor Mina began calculating. The highest in the Institute's history, Veltaris finished quietly. The simulation pod opened. Daewon had been inside for 6 hours, living through 5 subjective years. He stood slowly, removing the neural interface with shaking hands. His face was pale, his eyes distant. Living through years of catastrophe, even in simulation, took a toll. He stumbled slightly as he exited the pod. A medical technician rushed forward to steady him. "Water," Daewon said hoarsely. "And food. Please." He didn't know yet that his examination had been watched by half the faculty. He didn't know that he'd completed a scenario meant for advanced research, not student testing. He didn't know he'd just become the most discussed student in 4,000 years of Institute history. He just knew he was exhausted, hungry, and ready to sleep for about a week. As the medical team led him toward the recovery area, Professor Veltaris watched him go, their crystalline form refracting light in thoughtful patterns. "Bring me everything we have on human history," Veltaris said quietly.
I need to understand how a species learns to think like that.
Daewon woke up 12 hours later in the medical recovery wing. His head hurt, his muscles ached, and he felt like he'd lived through 5 years of constant crisis management, which in a way he had. A medical attendant, a gentle being with soft purple fur, brought him a tray of food. "How are you feeling?" they asked. "Like I got hit by an asteroid," Daewon replied, then managed a weak smile at his own joke. The attendant didn't seem to understand the humor. He ate slowly, his mind still partially in the simulation. He kept thinking about the people he'd saved, even though he knew they weren't real. The children born in the caves, the engineers who'd drilled into the geothermal layers, the council members who'd argued about the surface outpost. They had felt real. Hana appeared in the doorway, carrying 2 cups of the terrible Institute coffee. "You're awake. Good. You've been the talk of the station for the past half day." Daewon accepted the coffee gratefully. "What do you mean?" "Your exam," Hana said, sitting down beside the medical bed. Apparently there was some kind of computer error. You got a scenario that was way harder than it should have been." "How much harder?" "About 4 times harder than a normal final exam. They're still deciding if your results count." Daewon blinked slowly. 4 times harder. That explains why it felt so impossible at the start. "Most people would have panicked," Hana observed. "You smiled." "Did I?" Daewon thought back to the moment the scenario had loaded. "I guess I was just relieved to finally face something challenging." The practice scenarios were all pretty simple. Hana laughed. "Simple? You just called extinction-level disasters simple. Compared to what actually happened to Earth throughout history, they kind of are," Daewon pointed out. "We had periods where multiple disasters hit at once. Ice ages and supervolcano eruptions, plagues and famines, wars and climate disasters. The exam was bad, but it wasn't unprecedented. For humans," Hana corrected. "For everyone else here, it's literally unimaginable." A soft chime indicated someone at the door. Professor Veltaris entered, their crystalline body catching the light and scattering it in rainbow patterns across the walls. "Student Daewon," the professor said formally. "How are you recovering?" "I'm okay, Professor. Tired, but okay." "I need to inform you of something," Veltaris said, and their tone suggested this was an official communication. "Your examination scenario was generated in error. You received a research-level catastrophe simulation meant for advanced analysis, not student testing. The faculty is currently in discussion about how to proceed." Daewon sat up straighter. "Are you going to make me retake it?" "That is one option being considered," Veltaris admitted. "However, there are complications. Your performance in the scenario you did receive was exceptional. Unprecedented, in fact. You achieved a 17.5% survival rate in conditions where theoretical models suggested less than 5% was possible." "Is that good?" Daewon asked, genuinely uncertain. Hana made a strangled sound. "Good? Daewon, that's incredible. Most students are happy if they hit 40% in a normal scenario, but I only saved 17%, Daewon protested. More than 80% of the population died. Professor Veltaris's crystalline form seemed to shimmer. "You faced 4 simultaneous extinction-level events. Mathematical models indicate that 99.9% mortality was the expected outcome. You saved nearly 18% and ensured civilization continuity. By adjusted metrics, your performance exceeds any student in the Institute's 4,000-year history." Daewon absorbed this information slowly. "So does that mean I passed?" "The faculty meeting is in 2 hours, Veltaris said. The decision will be made then. I wanted to inform you personally beforehand." After the professor left, Daewon looked at Hana. "Do you think they'll make me retake it?" "Honestly, I don't know," Hana replied. "This is completely unprecedented. But Daewon, you need to understand something. The way you handled that scenario shocked everyone, not just because you survived it, but because of how you thought about it." "What do you mean?" "You made decisions that most species can't even conceive of," Hana explained. "Deliberately infecting people with a plague. destroying infrastructure, accepting that 80% would die and planning for it. Those aren't things that come naturally to species that evolved on stable worlds. It's just triage, Day One said. When you can't save everyone, you save who you can. But most species don't think that way, Hannah said gently. They think saving people means preventing the disaster. You started from the assumption that the disaster was inevitable, and worked from there. Because it was inevitable, Day One pointed out. The asteroid was going to hit. The plague was already spreading. The shields were failing. Those weren't things I could stop in 72 hours. I know, Hannah said, but accepting that requires a kind of thinking that most aliens don't have. They see disasters as things to prevent. We see them as things to survive. The faculty meeting took place in the largest conference room at the Institute. 37 professors and senior staff attended, representing different departments and specializations. The room had been designed to accommodate various alien physiologies, with different atmosphere zones, gravity levels, and environmental controls. Professor Veltaris stood at the center presenting the case. The question before us is simple. How do we evaluate student Day One's examination performance? Simple, scoffed one professor, a being who looked like an angry cloud. Nothing about this situation is simple. The student received the wrong scenario entirely, but he completed it, countered Professor Mina, and he exceeded all possible expectations. Against a scenario he shouldn't have faced, the cloud professor argued. We should reset the examination and give him an appropriate test. With respect, Veltaris said, I'm not certain we have a scenario that would appropriately challenge him anymore. Our standard tests would be trivial for someone who just managed 4 simultaneous apocalypses. This caused a moment of uncomfortable silence. Another professor, this one with scales and multiple eyes, spoke up. Perhaps the real question is what this tells us about human cognition regarding catastrophic events. Should we be studying the performance itself? We already are, admitted Veltaris. The simulation recording has been requested by 6 different research departments. The psychology department is particularly interested in how he maintained functionality under what should have been psychologically devastating conditions. Let me understand this correctly, said a professor from the ethics department. This student deliberately spread a deadly disease, destroyed critical infrastructure, and wrote off 80% of the population as acceptable losses. And we're considering giving him the highest grade in our history. He saved 17.5% from 4 extinction events, Mina replied calmly. Show me your calculations for saving more than that under the same conditions. The ethics professor was silent. The question isn't whether his methods were pleasant, Veltaris said. The question is whether they were effective. Planetary crisis management isn't about making comfortable decisions. It's about ensuring species survival in worst-case scenarios. But should we be teaching students to think this way? Another professor asked. To accept mass death as part of the calculation? We're not teaching them that, Veltaris said quietly. Humans already think that way. They evolved that way, through repeated near-extinction events. We're not creating this mindset. We're observing it. A professor who had been silent until now, an ancient being whose species had existed for millions of years, finally spoke. I have reviewed the human historical archives. This species has faced more catastrophic disasters in their short existence than most species face in a million years of evolution. They have nearly gone extinct at least 12 times by their own records. They survived ice ages, supervolcano eruptions, plagues that killed significant portions of their population, and catastrophic wars of their own making. The ancient professor continued, They didn't survive these events by being lucky. They survived by being adaptable, ruthless when necessary, and willing to make choices that would horrify more stable species. Student Day One's performance isn't an anomaly. It's a demonstration of evolved survival traits. So what do you recommend? Asked Veltaris. I recommend we accept his performance as valid, the ancient professor said. But more than that, I recommend we begin developing a specialized curriculum for human students. Their approach to catastrophic management is fundamentally different from other species. We should be learning from them, not trying to fit them into our existing frameworks. This suggestion caused considerable debate. Some professors were enthusiastic. Others were deeply uncomfortable with the idea. Finally, a vote was called. Should Day One's examination performance be accepted as valid despite the scenario error? 32 voted yes. 5 voted no. The motion carries, Veltaris announced. Student Day 1's examination is accepted. His final grade will reflect both the difficulty of the scenario and his exceptional performance within it. What about the other matter? Asked Professor Mina. The proposal to study human disaster response more broadly? That will require further discussion, Veltaris said. But I suspect it's inevitable. We've just witnessed something that challenges our fundamental assumptions about crisis management. Ignoring it would be academically dishonest. After the meeting, Veltaris went to find Day 1. The young human was in the common area with Hana and several other students, all of whom had completed their examinations over the past day. Kiro, the Centaurian student, was describing his scenario. The asteroid was massive, and I had to coordinate 17 different deflection attempts. I managed to save 42% of the population. That's excellent, Hana said encouragingly. What about you, Day 1? Asked Tella, the blue-feathered student. How did your exam go? Day 1 hesitated. It was complicated. Student Day 1, Professor Veltaris interrupted, approaching the group. May I speak with you privately? They moved to a quiet corner of the common area. Veltaris looked at Day 1 with an expression that was hard to read on a crystalline face. The faculty has made their decision, the professor said. Your examination performance is accepted as valid. You have passed with the highest grade in the Institute's recorded history. Day 1 blinked. Really? But I only saved 17%. You saved 17% from conditions that should have resulted in complete extinction. Veltaris corrected gently. The adjusted score reflects that. You should be proud. I'm not sure proud is what I feel, Day 1 admitted. I keep thinking about all the people I couldn't save, even though I know they weren't real. That's interesting, Veltaris said. Many species would focus on their success. You're focusing on the failures. Failures are how you learn, Day 1 said simply. Success just tells you what worked. Failure tells you what to improve. Veltaris made a note on their datapad. Would you be willing to discuss your examination performance with some research faculty? Your approach to the scenario has generated significant academic interest. I guess so, Day 1 said, though I'm not sure what I can tell them that isn't already in the simulation recording. Sometimes the why is more important than the what, Veltaris said. We can see what you did. We want to understand why you chose those specific actions. As the professor walked away, Hana appeared beside Day 1. So what happened? I passed, Day 1 said. Apparently with the highest score ever. I knew it, Hana grinned. You just made history, Day 1. I just did what seemed logical, Day 1 protested. That's what makes it so impressive, Hana replied. To you, managing 4 apocalypses at once seems logical. To everyone else, it's impossible. Day 1 thought about this, sipping his terrible coffee. Is it really that different? The way humans think versus other species? Yes, Hana said simply. We come from a world that tried very hard to kill us. They come from worlds that mostly let them live. That creates fundamental differences in how we approach problems. Seems like a lonely way to think, Day 1 observed. Maybe, Hana agreed, but it's kept us alive. 3 weeks after the examination, the Galactic Survival Institute held its graduation ceremony. The massive auditorium was filled with students, faculty, and visitors from across the galaxy. Beings of hundreds of different species gathered to celebrate the newest class of certified planetary crisis managers. Day 1 sat in the front row with Hana and the other top-performing students. He wore the formal human clothing that was considered appropriate for such occasions, feeling slightly uncomfortable under the attention. Since his examination results had become public knowledge, he'd been approached by dozens of people wanting to discuss his approach to the scenario. Some were academic researchers. Others were government officials from various worlds. A few were just curious students from other programs who wanted to meet the human who'd survived 4 apocalypses at once. You okay? Hana whispered. Just ready for this to be over. Day 1 admitted. I don't like being famous. Too bad, Hana said with a slight smile. You're probably going to be in textbooks now. The ceremony began with speeches from various administrators. They talked about the importance of disaster preparedness, the responsibility that came with planetary crisis management certification, and the bright futures awaiting the graduates. Then Professor Veltaris took the stage. Their crystalline form caught the auditorium lights and scattered them across the audience in beautiful patterns. This year's graduating class has achieved remarkable things, Veltaris began. Your average scores are the highest in a decade. Your practical performance exceeded expectations. But one student in particular has given us cause to reconsider some of our fundamental assumptions about crisis management. Daewon felt hundreds of eyes turned toward him. Student Daewon, Veltaris continued, completed an examination scenario that should have been impossible. In doing so, he demonstrated an approach to catastrophic events that many species find difficult to comprehend. His success rate, when adjusted for scenario difficulty, is the highest in our 4,000-year history. Applause filled the auditorium, though Daewon noticed it was mixed. Some species applauded enthusiastically. Others seemed more reserved, perhaps uncomfortable with what his success represented. But beyond the numbers, Veltaris said, what student Daewon showed us was a different philosophy of survival. One born from a species that has faced extinction repeatedly and refused to accept it. His examination has become required viewing for all future students and has spawned 6 separate research projects into human cognitive approaches to disaster scenarios. More applause. And this time, Daewon noticed that several faculty members were standing. After the formal ceremony, there was a reception in the main hall. Graduates mingled with faculty and visitors, celebrating their achievements. Daewon found himself surrounded by people wanting to congratulate him or ask questions. Kiro approached with his usual friendly manner. Daewon, I finally got clearance to watch your examination recording. It was incredible, but also terrifying. How did you stay calm when everything was falling apart? I didn't really have a choice, Daewon replied honestly. Panicking wouldn't have helped anyone. But the decisions you made, Kiro said, his 3 eyes blinking in sequence. Spreading the plague deliberately, destroying the reactors, accepting that most people would die. Those must have been so difficult. They were, Daewon admitted, but they were also necessary. Sometimes the hard choice is the only choice. Tella joined the conversation, her blue feathers ruffled with obvious distress. I couldn't have done it. When I watched the recording, I had to stop several times. The part where you attended the memorial for the people who died in the cave collapse. How did you continue after that? Because the living still needed me, Daewon said simply. Grief is important, but it can't stop you from doing what needs to be done. Professor Mina approached, their golden spheres orbiting each other in patterns that suggested excitement. Daewon, I wanted to tell you personally that your examination has revolutionized our understanding of crisis psychology. We're completely restructuring our curriculum based on insights from your performance. I'm not sure I did anything that special, Daewon protested. I just applied basic survival principles. That's exactly the point, Mina replied. What you consider basic survival principles are advanced concepts to most species. The idea of accepting inevitable losses and optimizing for partial survival, rather than attempting total prevention, represents a paradigm shift for us. An official-looking being approached, wearing the insignia of the Galactic Colonial Administration. Student Daewon, I'm Administrator Jax from the Colonial Crisis Response Division. We've been reviewing your examination performance and we'd like to offer you a position with our organization. Daewon blinked in surprise. I haven't even officially graduated yet. We're aware, Administrator Jax said, but talent like yours doesn't come along often. We have several colony worlds experiencing early-stage crises that could benefit from your expertise. The compensation would be substantial, and you'd have full authority to implement whatever solutions you deemed necessary. I appreciate the offer, Daewon said carefully, but I need some time to think about it. Of course, Jax said, handing him a data chip. My contact information is here. Please consider it seriously. The galaxy needs people who can think the way you do. After the administrator left, Hana appeared at Daewon's side. Job offers already? We haven't even received our certificates yet. Apparently my exam made an impression, Daewon said wryly. It made more than an impression, Hana replied. It scared a lot of people. Made them realize how unprepared they are for real catastrophes. A group of younger students approached nervously. They were first years, barely starting their studies. One of them, a small being with green scales, spoke up. Excuse me, Student Daewon. We were wondering if you had any advice for us. We're all starting crisis management studies next term. Daewon thought about this carefully. The most important thing is to understand that disasters don't care about your plans. No matter how well you prepare, something will go wrong. The key is being able to adapt when your perfect solution falls apart. But how do you learn to adapt? Another student asked. By accepting that failure is part of the process, Daewon said. Every disaster has multiple failure points. You can't prevent all of them. So you plan for the failures, create backup systems, and never assume anything will work perfectly. That sounds exhausting, one student said. It is, Daewon agreed. But it's also how you save lives when everything goes wrong. Professor Veltaris joined them, gently steering Daewon away from the growing crowd. You're becoming quite popular.
How does it feel?
Overwhelming, Daewon admitted. I just wanted to pass my exam. You did more than pass, Veltaris said. You've changed how we think about catastrophic management. But I wanted to ask you something personal. During the simulation, when you realized 80% of the population would die, how did you emotionally process that? Daewon was quiet for a moment. I didn't really process it during the simulation. I just focused on saving who I could. Afterward, though, when I woke up in medical recovery, I felt terrible about it, even though I knew they weren't real people. Why terrible? You saved more than anyone thought possible. Because each person who died represented a failure, Daewon explained. Every single one was someone I couldn't save. The fact that I saved some doesn't erase the loss of the others. That's a very human way of thinking, Veltaris observed. Most species would celebrate the victory. You mourn the losses, can't you do both? Daewon asked. Apparently humans can, Veltaris said thoughtfully. That might be your species' real strength. Not just the ability to survive, but the ability to care about those who don't, while still functioning through the crisis. Later that evening, after the crowds had dispersed, Daewon and Hana sat in an observation lounge overlooking the station's view of space. The dying star that the Institute orbited cast an orange glow across the viewport. So what are you going to do? Hana asked. Take the colonial administration job. I don't know, Daewon said. Part of me wants to go home to Earth, see familiar places again. But another part thinks I should use what I've learned out here. The galaxy needs people like you, Hana said quietly. People who can face the worst possible scenarios and find a way through them. The galaxy has billions of people, Daewon pointed out. I'm just one person. One person who just proved that humans think about disasters differently than anyone else, Hana replied. That's valuable, Daewon. The simulation recordings are already being distributed to crisis management centers across the galaxy. Your approach is going to influence how entire civilizations prepare for disasters. Daewon looked out at the dying star, thinking about the simulation, the caves, the survivors, the long volcanic winter. Even knowing it wasn't real, the experience had changed him. He'd lived through 5 years of constant crisis management, made 1,000 impossible decisions, and carried the weight of millions of lives. Do you think we're different? He asked finally. Humans, I mean. Are we fundamentally different from other species because of Earth's history? Yes, Hana said without hesitation. We come from a world that has tried to kill us in every way imaginable. Ice ages, supervolcanoes, plagues, asteroids, climate catastrophes. Every generation of humans has lived with the possibility of extinction. That shapes how we think. Is it better or worse, thinking this way? Neither, Hana said. It's just different. Most species see disasters as aberrations, things that shouldn't happen. We see them as inevitabilities, things we need to be ready for. There's no moral superiority either way. It's just adaptation to different environments. The professor said I changed how they think about crisis management. Daewon said, that feels like a lot of responsibility. You showed them that survival isn't about preventing every disaster, Hana replied. It's about having the courage to face disaster and the wisdom to accept what you can't change while fighting for what you can. That's a lesson the galaxy needed to learn. A message appeared on Daewon's datapad. It was from Professor Veltaris. Tomorrow at 0900 you have a meeting with the research faculty. They want to discuss developing a new curriculum track for human students. Your input would be valuable. Daewon showed the message to Hana. They want me to help design courses? Makes sense, Hana said. You just demonstrated a completely different approach to disaster scenarios. Who better to help teach it? I'm not a teacher, Daewon protested. Maybe not yet, Hana agreed. But you're a survivor, and sometimes that's the most important qualification. The next morning, Daewon met with a group of faculty members in a conference room. They had questions about his decision-making process, his emotional management during the simulation, and his overall philosophy on catastrophic events. "When did you decide that saving everyone was impossible?" one professor asked. "About 30 seconds after reading the scenario briefing," Daewon replied honestly. 4 simultaneous extinction events with 72 hours warning? Complete survival wasn't an option, so I focused on maximizing partial survival instead. Most students spent hours trying to find a way to prevent the disasters, another professor noted. "You immediately accepted them as inevitable. Why?" "Because accepting reality is the first step in dealing with it," Daewon said. "If I spent hours looking for a miracle solution that didn't exist, that's hours I couldn't spend on solutions that might actually work." The professors exchanged glances. "That's a very pragmatic approach," one said. "Some might call it pessimistic. I call it realistic," Daewon replied. "Hope is important, but hope doesn't stop asteroids. Action does. You can hope for the best while planning for the worst." They talked for hours, discussing everything from resource allocation strategies to psychological management of survivors. The professors took extensive notes, occasionally asking for clarification on specific decisions from the simulation. Finally, Professor Veltaris asked the question that seemed to be on everyone's mind. "How does your species maintain hope when you're constantly preparing for catastrophe? Doesn't the expectation of disaster become psychologically damaging?" Daewon thought about this carefully. "I think it's the opposite, actually. Preparing for disasters gives you a sense of control. You're not helpless. You're ready, and knowing you're ready makes the fear manageable." "Fascinating," Veltaris said, making notes. "So preparation reduces anxiety rather than increasing it?" "For humans, yes," Daewon confirmed. "We sleep better knowing we have emergency kits, evacuation plans, and survival strategies." It's not pessimism. It's prudence. The meeting eventually concluded with the faculty agreeing to develop a new elective track focusing on what they called adaptive crisis management using human cognitive frameworks. Daewon was asked to serve as a consultant for the curriculum development. Graduation day arrived officially, with the formal certificate distribution. Daewon walked across the stage, shook hands with various administrators, and received his Planetary Crisis Management certification. The applause when his name was called was notably louder than for other students. As he returned to his seat, certificate in hand, he caught sight of the live stream display. His graduation was being broadcast to dozens of worlds across the galaxy. Millions of beings were watching. After the ceremony, as Daewon packed his belongings to leave the institute, he found a message waiting in his quarters. It was a video call request from Earth, from the director of the Global Disaster Response Coordination Center. He accepted the call, and a woman's face appeared on the screen. She smiled warmly. "Daewon, I'm Director Park. I've been following your progress at the Institute. Congratulations on your graduation and your record-breaking examination." "Thank you, Director. I'm calling to offer you a position with our organization," Director Park continued. "We need people who can think clearly during catastrophes, and your performance suggests you have that ability. We'd like you to join our advanced crisis response team." "I've received several job offers," Daewon said carefully. "I'm sure you have," Director Park agreed. "But Earth is your home, and Earth, more than anywhere else in the galaxy, understands the value of what you can do. We've survived disasters that would extinct most species. We need people who can help us continue surviving." Daewon looked around his quarters at the Institute, thinking about the past months. The simulations, the studying, the examination that had changed everything. Then he thought about Earth, about home, about a world that had shaped him into someone who could face 4 apocalypses and smile. "Can I have some time to think about it?" he asked. "Of course," Director Park said. "Take all the time you need." "But Daewon, whatever you decide, know that your species is proud of you. You showed the galaxy what humans are capable of. That matters." After the call ended, Daewon sat quietly for a while. Hana knocked and entered, carrying her own packed bags. "Ready to leave?" she asked. "Almost," Daewon replied. "Just thinking about what comes next." "Whatever you choose, it'll be the right choice," Hana said. "You've got good instincts for these things." They walked through the institute one last time, past the lecture halls where they'd studied, the simulation center where they'd trained, and the observation lounges where they'd spent countless hours discussing disaster scenarios. At the departure terminal, They found Cairo, Tella, and several other classmates waiting to say goodbye. "You're really leaving?" Kiro asked. "Everyone's leaving," Daewon pointed out. "That's what graduation means." "I know, but it feels wrong somehow," Kiro said. "Like we should all stay together. The team that survived the hardest year of Institute history." "We'll stay in touch," Hana promised. "And who knows? Maybe we'll work together on some crisis somewhere in the galaxy." "I hope not," Tella said, then laughed nervously. I hope there aren't any crises that need all of us." "There will be," Daewon said quietly. "There always are, but now we're ready for them." They said their final goodbyes, exchanged contact information, and made promises to meet again. Then Daewon and Hana boarded the transport that would take them back toward human space. As the ship pulled away from the Institute, Daewon looked back at the massive station floating near its dying star. He'd arrived months ago as a student hoping to learn disaster management. He was leaving as someone who'd demonstrated an entirely new approach to catastrophic survival. "Any regrets?" Hana asked. "About what?" "About becoming famous. About changing how the galaxy thinks about disasters. About showing everyone that humans are different." Daewon considered this. "No regrets. If sharing what I know helps save lives somewhere, then it was worth it." The transport entered faster than light travel, and the Institute disappeared from view. They had several days of travel ahead before reaching Earth. During the journey, Daewon spent time reviewing the job offers he'd received. The Colonial Administration wanted him for frontier crisis response. Several individual planets wanted him as a consultant for their disaster preparedness programs. A private corporation offered him a position developing crisis management AI systems, and Earth wanted him home, working with humanity's own disaster response network. "What are you thinking?" Hana asked one evening as they sat in the observation deck. "I'm thinking about something Professor Velteris said," Daewon replied. "About how humans mourn losses even while celebrating victories. About how we can care about those we couldn't save while still functioning through the crisis." "What about it?" "I think that's what I want to do," Daewon said slowly. "Not just respond to disasters, but help people understand that it's okay to feel both things. That survival doesn't mean you're not allowed to grieve. That being prepared doesn't mean you're expecting the worst, just that you're ready for it." "That sounds like teaching," Hana observed. "Maybe," Daewon agreed. "Maybe that's what I'm supposed to do. Not just manage crises, but teach people how to think about them differently." The transport finally arrived at Earth orbit. Looking down at the blue and green planet, Daewon felt something settle in his chest. This was home. This was the world that had nearly killed humanity dozens of times and had created a species that refused to die. Director Park was waiting at the orbital station when they docked. She greeted them warmly and led them to a conference room with a view of Earth. "I know you haven't made a decision yet," she said, "but I wanted to show you something."